Finding Hope, the Road to Recovery.
Hi, welcome to Finding Hope, the Road to Recovery. We're here today to talk about trauma and substance use and how the two are closely linked and have an impact on one another. My name is Lauren Dibbs. I'm the Director of Services at Tarzana Treatment Centers in the Long Beach area. And I'm here today with a couple guests, and hopefully we can talk about how important it is to treat trauma for those in recovery for substance abuse, and how it's often not fully explored to the extent it should be as an important part of recovery. So today I'd like to introduce my guest. This is John Lavitt. He's the principal content creator for Tarzana Treatment Centers, and he's also a well-known journalist in recovery and in many other genres. Welcome, John.
Lauren, it's so great to be here today. I thought it might, because I'm in recovery and because I've gone through trauma myself, I thought it might make sense to start off by telling a little bit about my personal story and my experience with trauma. It's funny because I don't talk about this story very often anymore. I used to wear my trauma on my sleeve like it was my badge of honor. The first thing I would do when I met someone was like, let me tell you what happened to me when I was a kid. My trauma was rooted in basically a challenge that I faced growing up where I was a stutterer. Growing up, Lauren, I was a 20% stutterer, 1 out of every 5 words.
Wow. So
basically, I went to a very exclusive private school in New York. It was called the Dalton School, and I was called a survivor when I graduated.
And why is that? Why is the word survivor used?
70% of my class, 70 out of 100 kids, were called survivors because we were there from kindergarten all the way to graduating high school.
Oh, wow.
For 15 years. So basically, because I stuttered in kindergarten and in first grade, I got a bad reputation then, and it stuck with me throughout. It stuck with me from the beginning all the way through, and I was mercilessly picked on. I remember on the gym bus every day, there were 2 kids that were picked on, myself and this other kid who was overweight. And I remember how, God, I made an amends to him several years ago, because I would pick on him so much to deflect the trauma off of me.
Yeah, that's very common.
I wanted him to have the focus. I wanted him to be punished. And I felt so bad about that in retrospect. And he was like, John, good Lord, you took so much abuse. Don't worry about it.
Well, that's nice. He could have had a different reaction.
Yeah, and his reaction was like that we both went through it really badly. For me, however, the way I dealt with it, particularly in high school, was through drugs and alcohol. I remember when I found marijuana, and it became like a savior to me because it gave me an identity. It gave me a way to make friends. It gave me a way to connect with people. Smoking pot was, for me, it was like the answer. And that's how my whole very sick and addictive relationship with drugs began. And at the same time, they also, in a sense, saved me as well, because I was in so much pain, and it gave me a real sense of identity. You know what that's like.
Yeah, well, so all the teasing that you experienced over such a long period of your childhood was a very traumatic experience, I can imagine. And it's understandable that you'd want to escape that with whatever you could get. So we do talk about substance use is a coping mechanism. It's not necessarily a healthy one. We call it a maladaptive coping mechanism, but it is a coping mechanism. And for many, it's the only coping mechanism they know or that they're taught. And it's easy, sadly, it's very easy to find. So I think particularly in childhood and adolescence, it is the first go-to coping strategy that kids use. And then once there's an addiction developed, it's really hard to divorce oneself from that. It's hard to unspill the milk, as they say.
100%. And as a journalist, I really was lucky enough that I was able to interview the top addictionologist in the world today, which is Dr. Gabor Maté. He's Canadian, and I've interviewed him actually four separate times.
Wow.
My first interview for him, which was for a website that no longer exists, for 15 years it was a top daily news site about addiction and recovery called thefix.com. It had over 80,000 Facebook shares.
Wow.
I mean, it was incredible. And I have a quote from that interview where Dr. Gabor Maté, his essence is, what he says is, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. He sees the root of all addiction as childhood trauma. And if you're not addressing the trauma, if you're not addressing the pain, then you're just dealing with the symptom and not the cause.
You're just masking it. And that's so true. And, in my work as a clinician, I am also a licensed marriage and family therapist. And in recovery myself, I can say that when we are using, I use an expression a lot, and I call it pulling the ripcord, which is an escape from the pain. And one of the things I talk about in addiction is I say that no human being likes to feel discomfort or pain. And one of the things I say is that, there's a spectrum all the way starting at minor discomfort all the way up to severe pain. And it's both emotional and physical. It can be either or. And so we say that no human being likes to be in discomfort or even pain. But as addicts, we have a particularly low threshold of tolerance for it, whereby we want to pull the ripcord as soon as we experience it. And so we lack the resilience to work through it and to tolerate the discomfort. And to me, that's an important piece of this. It's not that we should approach our trauma as something that we just simply tolerate. We do have to work through it. It's very important to work through the trauma with a knowledgeable professional.
I also love what you just said of pulling the ripcord, because what does that mean? It means opening up the parachute.
Yes.
What does a parachute does? A parachute saves our lives.
Yes.
Otherwise, we on the ground.
Right.
And so the fact is, for me, I felt like I was saving my life.
Yes.
I felt like this is what I was doing. I actually want to read something from my first interview with Dr. Gabor Maté. I got to put on my glasses. I'm getting old. And basically, I asked him this question, which was, in your seminal work on addiction in the realm of hungry ghosts, and I love that title, Lauren. I love in the realm of hungry ghosts. You explain how childhood trauma leads to the creation of a harmful personal mythology. How can a person escape such a self-defeating prophecy? How hard is it to fully overcome such a storyline? And he replied in something that was so deeply moving to me at the time, and is still to this day. Dr. Gabor Maté said, "By nature, John, we are born into the world expecting to be nurtured and loved and supported, understood and seen and heard, because that's how human beings evolved. In fact, that's how any mammal evolved. When that doesn't happen, when we're hurt for whatever reason, when we're simply not seen or understood or nurtured emotionally in the way that we need, then we immediately come to believe, and this belief becomes ingrained in our psyches, that there's something wrong with us. Human nature is to be connected and loving, open and social, and compassionate. Not being able to be true to our nature is one of the reasons why we suffer. That true nature is still working for us, and it's still inside us. The very suffering itself helps to wake us up. That very suffering helps to guide us in the right direction if we are open to receiving the guidance. In the addiction movement, people talk about recovery. What does it mean to recover something? It means to find it. When you recover something, you get it back. In other words, what we get back is ourselves, which is the essence of all healing."
Wow. That's pretty powerful. And I particularly like breaking down the word recovery. To recover means to get something back. And for some people, it's to get something that they've never had, which is internal peace with all the experiences they've had, good or bad. So
and authenticity.
Authenticity is important too. So I think what this tells me is how important it is that those in recovery from substance abuse really give themselves an opportunity to deeply and authentically explore the trauma that they've suffered, and to do so in a way that they are able to come to peace with it and move forward in their lives. Because the unfinished business, the unspoken pain that we try to bury, the more we try to bury it, the more more unsuccessful we are in moving forward in our lives. It's almost like a pressure cooker is the way I look at it.
So Lauren, as a recovery professional, I mean, I think what you're saying is that getting sober doesn't just mean stopping. It doesn't just mean detoxing. It's like basically the act of stopping then opens the door to the opportunity to do the real work and the healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is so important to do that work. And I see examples of both in my work with those in recovery at Tarzana Treatment Centers. I run a 90-bed residential facility, co-ed residential facility, and an outpatient facility. And particularly in the residential setting, it's really challenging for those in recovery to stay and sit with just themselves. They don't have their cell phones. They don't have a lot of opportunities for distraction. And that's usually the time when the trauma starts bubbling up. I always use that analogy. It's like 7-Up bubbles or soda bubbles that just start coming off the glass and start coming to the surface. And when that happens and they don't have their primary coping mechanism, which is the drug or the drink, then it's extremely uncomfortable, even painful. And that's when people unfortunately run out of treatment. And it's really discouraging and heartbreaking. Usually this happens when people start getting into the really meaningful work around their trauma. And so we do everything possible to educate those who come into our facility to normalize what that's going to be like, to get them prepared. It's sometimes, and you may have heard this expression, sometimes it feels like it's getting worse before it gets better.
Of course. And
that's so true when it comes to doing work around trauma.
I have another question for you, Lauren, where when I interviewed Gabor, he actually quoted trauma pioneer Peter Levine, where he said, Peter Levine wrote that trauma has become so commonplace that most people don't even recognize its presence. And Gabor talked to me about trauma phobia, that our society itself is traumaphobic. People don't want to deal with trauma. People want you to be a good, happy little consumer.
That's right. And technology, I'll say, has only made that worse because we have so many opportunities for distraction from our trauma.
What do you do with a client, a patient, who is traumaphobic, who's so ingrained and designed not to deal with their trauma that when it comes up, they just run away from it?
That's an excellent question. And there's really, if I had the formula to that, we would have a lot more people in recovery, to be honest with you. There is no magic pill to that. But like I said before, I think a lot of it is about educating them that you're really not going to move forward with the goals that you've set out for yourself unless you face and work through the reasons for underlying your addiction, which is the trauma. And I think that's, for many people, there's a lot of stops and starts in recovery. They'll relapse over it. And you've heard the expression, of course, being sick and tired of feeling sick and tired.
Right, sure.
And sometimes for some of those people, that's what it takes. For some individuals, they are so exhausted from the merry-go-round of getting sober, relapsing, getting sober, relapsing, that they finally say, okay, it's exhaustion. It's pure emotional exhaustion, saying, okay, I'll do whatever is needed. And for some, that's what it takes. And we hope that they don't lose their lives or have some other irreparable damage before that happens.
I also love the idea of keeping your bottom close to you as you progress in recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, the essence of my spirituality in recovery is gratitude. And the fact is, a bad day today is nothing compared to what my bad days were when I was in the grips of my addiction.
That's right.
I mean, they were so ugly and so extreme, and I did so much damage. And yet at times I take my recovery for granted because I'm so focused on success or this or that or getting what I want, that I forget how far I've come and that I have to stay grateful for that journey and for making that progress.
Absolutely. And you have how many years of recovery?
I am blessed to have been sober now for 15 years.
That's amazing. That's great. So now put that in perspective with someone who has 5 days of recovery.
Right.
And imagine how hard it is for them to stay in gratitude. But you're absolutely right. And one of our tasks as treatment providers is to continually remind those that we serve to stay humble and grateful, and to remind them that this is a journey. This is not an end point. And one of the tools that I use, and I have all these little tools and analogies and interesting tidbits that I use when I'm working with people. But I draw a little stick figure of a person going up a hill. And I just do a rudimentary hill and then I level it off at the top. And the stick figure is pushing a giant boulder. And they're pushing it up.
Like Sisyphus from the Greek mythology.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. Just like Sisyphus. That's a good journalist for you. Good reference there, John. But pushing that boulder up the hill, that initial very steep incline before it levels out, is what the early stages of recovery are. Now, whatever length of time that is varies from person to person. For one person, that early grueling stage might be 6 months. For another, it might be 5 years. But unfortunately, a lot of people push the boulder up. They get tired of the discomfort or pain. They let go of it. It rolls back down. Maybe it rolls over them. And then they have to start all over again. And for many, it's just a process of that really steep part. They never experience the benefit of getting to what I call cruise control at the top. And that's doesn't mean we let our foot off the accelerator in terms of our recovery efforts. It means that we've got some routine and it's not as grueling as in the initial stages. And I look at trauma that way, that in the beginning, it can feel exhausting. Like I cannot sustain this. If this is what recovery looks like and I have to feel this, I'm not down for this.
Because when I was first in recovery, I hadn't been feeling for so long.
That's right.
It's like, oh my God, it's like, and my feelings were like a live wire. I was dampening those feelings for so long. The other thing I want to mention, I want to read one other quote from Gabor. Mm-hmm. Because it kind of connects to something else where the trauma in recovery is not just with the individual, but it's a family issue as well. That involves, and that often involves, so just one quick part of the quote is we all have to look at ourselves. We all have to compassionately consider how our family has carried forward suffering for generations. that is the only way in which the whole family will be able to heal. And I feel like, in a sense, part of my journey was not just dealing with my own trauma, but then being able to share that with my family, make amends, and be a living example of what recovery is, which is the ongoing processing of trauma.
That is a beautiful summary of what we've talked about. And John, I feel like I could talk to you all day.
I wish we could.
I think your story is fascinating, and I want to thank you for sharing it with us, because I think it really beautifully illustrates how inextricably linked trauma is to substance use. But I also like that you shared the fact that you have 15 years of recovery and that it is possible to recover from trauma and substance abuse. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Right. And I think it's also directly connected to the title of this program, Finding Hope, the Road to Recovery, is once you find the hope, that doesn't mean the road to recovery ends. It really is the beginning of the road to recovery. And the road to recovery is a road that I am so grateful to be able to be on for the rest of my life, I hope.
Great. Thanks again, John.
It's been
Appreciate
a pleasure
having you here.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back for part 2. Stay with us. Welcome back to Finding Hope, the Road to Recovery. Today we are talking about substance abuse and trauma. It's like peanut butter and jelly. The two go together, sadly, more often than not. But there is hope and there is a journey to recovery. And that's what we're talking about today. So thank you for joining us. Welcome back to part 2. Where I have another guest here today to talk about his experience on both sides of the coin. I'd like to introduce Dane Jones. He's the Senior Supervisor at Tarzana Treatment Centers, Long Beach, and also someone in recovery.
Yeah. Thanks
so
for
welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that we're talking about the effects of trauma and substance abuse, because the effects of trauma and substance abuse are very great. Having substance abuse issues is one thing, but the trauma can make it much more complex to recover, and you face other challenges that other people may not. And so focusing on that trauma and those core things is extremely important.
I think, one of the things that it's important when we talk about this is, what is trauma? Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes up a lot is, well, what defines a traumatic event?
Right.
And as a clinician myself, I always educate people that what may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you. We may experience the same event, mm-hmm. and because we have different coping mechanisms, I may experience it as a trauma, but you may not.
Right.
So it's an individually defined event or series of events, but they are, as John, our previous guest, mentioned, it's the underlying root of why we drink and use.
Right. Well, absolutely. And, the traumas and how they affect us have to do with our perception as well, of the event. And like you said, no trauma is the same for two individuals, but how we are impacted by it and, how it affects us, short-term and long-term, is really kind of what makes the difference.
That's
right?
True.
And so, that's...
You've got such a great story, personal story, and I'm really honored that you're willing to share it with us.
Yeah.
And that's why I asked you to be a guest today, because it's a pretty powerful story.
Yeah.
And so if you want to share a little bit.
Absolutely. I had been prescribed, prescription opiate painkillers when I was a freshman in high school from an injury, playing football. And I liked the way it made me feel. And, I was warned about the addictive piece. And I thought, oh, that's not going to happen to me, right? And it did. It absolutely did. And it spiraled out of control. And, of course, it's not a common story anymore. It moved on to heroin. And, at times in my life, I was able to, balance my usage with, having a professional life in some sense. I would kind of build my life back up and tear it back down again. But, ultimately, I found myself living on Skid Row. And
Wow.
that was, I never thought that was going to happen. And, that was a series of traumas as well, right? That had a huge impact on me and had a huge impact on my ability to recover.
So you're saying that while living on Skid Row, while being an unhoused person,
Correct.
that you experienced many sub-traumas within that trauma.
Absolutely.
That just added
yes.
to the pain.
Well, those traumas look like, some of it is just the way that you're treated as somebody who's unhoused. And some of those traumas, that's one thing, the way that people look at you and, react to you and speak to you and things like that. But that world is a violent world. And, I've witnessed many acts of violence in many different forms. And so those things have had a very large impact on me. They had a lot of different physiological impacts, things that I didn't realize were happening. But later on, after experiencing those things, I had physiological reactions. Anytime something happened in my life that kind of appeared similar to any of those, events. It also had psychological ramifications as well. Being in situations where fear kind of takes over and, that fight or flight mode really kind of takes control of the situation. And you're not thinking with your logical brain, you're thinking with your protective.
Your animal brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so.
Were you aware of that, Dane, when at the time, or is this insight that you've gained after the fact, now that you're in recovery?
So definitely a lot of insight, since being in recovery, but I knew that I was different than I had previously been. And what I mean by that is it affected my personality. It affected my ability to connect with other people.
Your trauma did?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I found it very hard to trust other people. And I found it very hard to make meaningful relationships because I didn't trust other people enough to actually develop a relationship.
You
right?
probably started thinking, what's wrong with me?
Oh, absolutely. I felt like there's something wrong with me. And I felt like I could never go back to being the same person that I was before. And, I heard the definition of recovery that you guys were talking about earlier. And I think that was such a fantastic explanation because that really rang true to me.
Yeah. Recovering things. To recover means to get back something that we've lost.
Yeah. Yeah. And I felt very damaged, and I really didn't think that I would ever be able to be that same sociable person and, be in a group of people and feel comfortable and confident.
So using substances then became a way of, to use our earlier analogy, pulling the ripcord, escaping the pain that you may not have even been aware of,
right,
that you were experiencing, that
right,
was in your body.
Yes.
And self-medicating, if you will.
It was absolutely an escape. Looking back in retrospect now, I realized that I was escaping something that was so deeply ingrained in me. I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but I was self-medicating 100% every single day.
So how do you go from being on Skid Row, an unhoused person in a full-blown opioid addiction, with a history of trauma, to where you are today?
Well, the one thing
where take me. I mean, how did you get into recovery?
So that's an interesting question, and I really didn't know if it was ever possible, but I got to the point where I had accepted that I was unhoused and I was living on Skid Row, and I was kind of okay with that. But I had come to a certain place in my life where I realized that I was probably going to be down there for a very long time. And, I had seen people that had told me they'd been there for 20 years, and I didn't want that to be me. And so the last time that I got arrested, I actually wanted to go to jail, and they almost didn't take me to jail. They were going to write me a ticket, the one time you want to go. But, they gave me an opportunity to go to a program, and I did that. I had been to programs before, but I always wanted to kind of do it my way. I didn't want to take a lot of the direction and insight that they gave me. I always tried to cut corners and,
the easier, softer path.
Absolutely.
Did you go on the continuum of care, starting at detox and then residential and then outpatient?
Yeah, I went through a 6-month residential program that didn't really offer an outpatient setting. But, what I did do was I got plugged into, Alcoholics Anonymous and things like that while I was in this program.
Okay.
But I had a therapist there that really made an impact on me. She gave me insight that, I just didn't have at the time. And it was not in a way of telling me what to do. It was in a way that she would mention something and, kind of throw it out as an idea and
lead you to discover it.
Correct. It was like she was setting a trail of breadcrumbs to help me get to the conclusion myself. And so, I've, since learned that that's called motivational interviewing. And, that I'm very passionate about that. But, that process took time, and it didn't end after 6 months of being, in a program. What I learned is that I lacked coping skills. It's like you talked about pulling the ripcord, right? Mm-hmm. So anytime I wanted to pull the ripcord, it's probably because something was happening that I wasn't able to cope with, successfully. So I got to a place where, not only did I have to develop coping skills, but I had to be, permanently conscious of my thoughts as they're happening. And that is truly a skill to do, because it's not very easy. A lot of us, think about when you're driving your car on your way to work. You might not realize, I passed this exit and this exit, and I saw a fire truck here, but you did, right?
Yeah.
So it's, for me, it was developing this sense of consciousness about where my brain was going, where my thoughts were. And I learned about this thing called neuroplasticity, which is basically my thought patterns followed a rut. And it was, these negative, the negative self-talk, things like, nobody loves me, I don't deserve to live, those sorts of things. Those were constantly playing in my brain for years.
And do you think that those thoughts were constantly on a feedback loop in your brain because of the trauma that you experienced?
Absolutely. I felt, like I said, damaged. I felt like I was damaged, and I felt like I didn't have value any longer.
And we know that shame and guilt is the fuel for addiction.
Absolutely.
It's like putting gasoline on a fire.
Yes.
That is absolutely the fuel that perpetuates ongoing substance use.
Yes.
When I feel shame or guilt or both, and I talk about, I use a lot of signs in the air, but this downward cycle. So when I experience shame or guilt, I use, which makes me feel shameful and guilty, which makes me want to use, which makes me feel shameful and guilty.
Correct.
So we know that one of the things we have to do is address that shame and guilt.
Yes.
And we have to remove it as much as possible. And that's not easy to do with a trauma survivor.
No, it's not. I had a therapist from years earlier. She said to me, "You are not your behavior." And I was probably 19 years old when she told me this.
Okay.
But it hit me like a sack of potatoes when I was 27. And I just, that statement popped into my head at this random time, and all of a sudden it made sense. And what that meant was that I'm not defined by those actions.
That's right.
I did those actions, right? I used and did all the things that go along with using, but that doesn't define my worth or value as a human being.
Or your character.
Or my character.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's important I think that's so important with trauma survivors.
Yes.
Is to say that is not who we are.
Mm-hmm.
That is external.
Correct.
The behaviors are external. They're not our core worth. And that goes to the self-esteem sort of work that we have to do when we're working through trauma.
And that was a huge piece of it for me too. I had to do esteemable acts. Most of which I really just didn't want to do. And this is simple things like making my bed and vacuuming the room and, being of service to others, right? But it was getting me out of my comfort zone. And I felt good about myself for doing them, right?
I love that you said esteemable acts because that's exactly how I define, people always ask the $1 million question. Well, how does one get self-esteem?
Right.
Again, I wish we had a magic pill, but self-esteem comes from esteemable acts, and it's the opposite of the downward spiral. That's the upward spiral. So when I do something that makes me feel good about myself, I feel good. It makes me do more esteemable acts, which make me feel good. And so here we go upwards with that spiral. So
totally.
That's so key. I'm glad you brought that up, Dane.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, when you were in treatment, and I'm sure that, as you started to work through this trauma, there were probably times where you just wanted to leave treatment.
Absolutely.
And to get out of there. What kept you from doing that?
So that actually happened quite often. Okay. There was a train that passed by the treatment center that I was at.
Not figuratively.
No, really.
Literally,
there was. And I used the train systems in downtown Los Angeles to get everywhere. And so when I would see this train, it was a huge trigger for me. And I saw it every day at 11:30 a.m. when I was walking to lunch.
Wow.
But, I kept telling myself, I'm not going to leave today, but tomorrow I just might. And eventually, I kept saying that to myself, and it was really hard. I mean, there was a couple times where I had my bags packed and things like that. But, it was also really important for me to develop meaningful friendships and relationships, which, as I told you earlier, that was difficult for me.
Yeah.
Right? I sought out people that I wouldn't usually hang out with. Right? The people I would usually hang out with were the people I was going to go get in trouble with.
Right.
So I had to find people and find a way to connect with them that, that I felt were safe, that weren't going to lead me down that same road. Because I know that, I was too weak to be around, I didn't have enough self-control, I guess is a better way to say that. To be around somebody that says, hey, I want to leave, let's go. And me not go and do that with them.
So when you started to do the work in treatment around your trauma, was there a particular person or moment that was really meaningful to you that kept you from running out the door?
I mean, yes. As I talked about, I had a therapist there that, she was really good at kind of leading me down these pathways. She gave me some coping skills to learn how to deal with those moments where I'm physiologically triggered, where I have a physical reaction to something that's happening, which was kind of those were the precursors that really made me want to walk out the door.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah.
Because our listeners may relate to that.
Sure.
So what's a physiological response that you had?
So, for example, loud noises. That was something, or when I would hear footsteps coming up behind me, it would send me into a fight or flight response. And, my physiological, reaction is literally the hair standing up on the back of my neck. And, I tense up, my jaw tightens up. And in my mind, it's saying, you have to go, you have to go, you have to go, you have to go. And so it was, the coping skills that my therapist gave me of being conscious of those thoughts and creating an internal dialogue, right? So this is me, my brain is telling me subconsciously, you've got to go, you've got to go. But consciously, I had to say, I'm not going to go. I'm going to work through this. I'm going to stay today.
Good.
And so that's where, that's really kind of a prime example of how that internal dialogue, really helped me. And it's something that I still use today.
Did your therapist teach you grounding techniques?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Grounding is one of my absolute favorite techniques as well, because
and we still use it. I still use it all the time.
I still use it. Absolutely.
Yes.
And grounding is, there's many different ways that you can, do grounding techniques, but the one that tended to work the best for me was I would look around the room and I'd go through the alphabet. I'd try to find everything that started with an A, everything that started with a B, everything that started with a C.
What does that have to do with somebody feeling better?
So what that has to do with feeling better is that your mind is in a fight or flight response mode, right? You are in a, I'm going to run, I've got to do something, because it wants you to act out on, the trigger that you've experienced,
right.
The impulse. Yes. What that does is it removes the power from that impulse.
Almost distracting your brain from that impulse.
Correct. And, so it distracts your brain from that impulse, which, once your heartbeat, lowers down, your blood pressure lowers down, your breathing starts to, normalize and regulate, you can think a little bit more clearly.
Yeah. And I like that grounding technique. I also really love the 5 senses.
Mm-hmm.
What do I feel? What do I smell? What do I hear?
Mm-hmm.
What do I see?
Yeah.
And that also is one of my favorites.
Totally. And that's what I love about it, is there's different ways of grounding that, that might react differently or better for one person than another. It's kind of like we talked about how one trauma might be, more powerful for one person and may have no effect on the other person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So I think that grounding not only helps us in the moment, but it helps build resilience.
Yeah.
And our ability to tolerate painful or uncomfortable situations. I talked a little bit earlier about the spectrum,
right, from
discomfort all the way up to severe pain.
Yeah.
And on any given day, that could be emotional or physical or both.
Right.
So, so in the couple minutes that we have left,
sure,
what's the rest of your story? So you were on Skid Row, you went into treatment.
Yeah.
I mean, now you're the senior supervisor at Tarzana Treatment Centers.
Yeah.
What got you there? What's the end of your story?
Well,
your story is still happening.
My story is still happening. But, I prior to all this, I had been in sales and finance and things like that. And I knew that I needed to do something different. And so I took a job working in treatment because someone that I knew from a meeting had opened up a treatment center. And I thought, this is just going to be a get well job. And I actually loved it. I loved getting to help other people. And so I decided to go back to school and I became a counselor. And that was really impactful for me. But, some of my other skills with, finances and sales and, those sorts of things came into play in more of an administrative piece. Right.
Okay.
And so I realized that I had some skills for that. So I started moving into, more administrative roles. And at first I struggled a little bit. I'm thinking like, I'm not helping people the same way. But what I realized is that I'm actually helping a larger number of people indirectly.
That's right.
It may not always be face to face, but I get to help other people, other counselors, other, staff members learn how to be effective.
Well, undoubtedly, you sharing your story here today and being so open and honest about your journey has helped a lot of people. I hope so. So I really thank you for being so willing to share your story and your time and your knowledge on, it's nice to talk to somebody who's been on both sides, like myself. Totally. We've been, we are in recovery and we're also clinicians helping others. Yeah. So this was great. Yeah. I really appreciate your time today. And I want to thank you for coming on the show. Well, thank you so much for having me. Yeah. And thank you for coming into our conversation about substance abuse and trauma. And we hope you got something from this today. Thank you.
Brought to you by Tarzana Treatment Centers. You can visit our website at www.tarzanatc.org or call 1-800-996-1051.